the various sources of data. So by the end of this section, you should understand that there are various sources of data, and you should be able to tell, which are more useful than others. And the most important thing we want you to take from this section is to understand that you're never going to get good results from bad data. Okay, we're doing statistics, we're not doing magic. Let's get started. So we said that stats is the science of collecting, organizing, and interpreting data. But how do you get this data to start from? It's really important to realize that if the way you collected the data is flawed, the whole study is flawed. And I particularly like this summary: garbage in, garbage out. You can do all the fancy analysis you want. If initially your data was not collected correctly, you will not get good results. And we discussed this already a little bit. Remember the question we had in a previous lecture about, is MATH1041 a good course? And then we said this question was way too vague. So before collecting data, you will need to go through these steps. You will need to refine your question and decide exactly what is the research question you want to ask. In that case, we said it could be whether you learn things which were useful in what you will do later on, or if it was a class which was enjoyable, so something about the experience of students, which are different things. Decide exactly what population you want to study. For example, still for this one, you may want to decide you want to know what happened a given year, because maybe there was a change in the way it was taught, or whether your population is wider, you want to look at different instances of that course. Decide exactly what you want to measure. What are the variables of interest? And of course, that's going to depend on what you actually want to study. And then you need to obtain some data. And that's what we are focusing on in this lecture. Let's start listening to different sources of data. Anecdotal data is haphazardly collected. So data from your own experience, a little story you heard, and often this story comes to our attention, or we remember them because there's something very striking about them. These stories are not a sound base for drawing conclusions. So an example of this type of data, maybe you notice that, let's say, you have a lot of friends doing math which are left-handed. So from that, you cannot draw the conclusion that being math and being left-handed come together. But that could give you an idea to start a study. So I would say anecdotal data can be the basis and make you wonder, am I onto something? And then from that, you may want to get started on a real study. Available data is usually, if it fits your purpose, is very handy because it's data that has been collected for other purposes and can help you answer your question. If it's available and it's free, it's going to save you time and money because you can reuse it right away. So for example, in Australia, the Australian Bureau of Statistics may already have some data which can help you answer your question. Of course, in many cases, after you decide what your research question is, and that could come from anecdotal data, if the data you need is not readily available, you may need to collect your own data. And that's what we're going to be focusing on in this course. These are a few examples which we've mentioned already. Now we need some vocabulary, because when we describe how the data collection works and what we do with it. The entire group of individuals of interest is called the population. So if you want to say something about Australian adults, then your population will be all the adults in Australia. Very often it's too complicated, too expensive, or it comes with issues to ask the question to the whole population. So instead, you focus on a subset of the population, and we call this a sample. So it's the part of the population that you actually examine to gather some information. Voluntary response sample, so that's a special case of sample, and it actually happens a lot. It's when this sample consists of people who choose to respond, right? And you've seen that, for example, when you read an article on the internet, very often there are some comments from people, and in that case, those people decided to answer. And what you probably notice is the people who took the time, who really wanted to answer, may be the ones who have a strong opinion. So you cannot assume that this sample of people who decided to get involved in something actually represent what the general population thinks. So you tend to get biased samples if you do it this way, because you get the people with a strong opinion. Census is actually, in terms of collecting information, the best one, because you systematically ask every individual in the population. Right? So in most countries, from time to time, there is a census, but it takes time and money. And so we don't do it like every year. And of course, only a certain number of questions are asked to those people. So even if there was a census right before you want to do an analysis, maybe it didn't answer your question of interest. Census versus sample. So census, you ask the whole population. Sample, you just ask a subset. So usually we don't ask the whole population. So we already said it costs time, it costs money, and sometimes it could be unethical to do so. For example, if you want to ask people about their dreams for the next 10 years, you wouldn't want to go ask that in hospital with, really sick people for whom there's not much hope. So another reason why we take sample is if you collect the data correctly, samples can be very informative. And an example of that is when you look at the opinion poll, you can predict the result of the election very accurately, provided that you really took a random sample. You didn't ask your friends or just a specific group of people, and provided the people didn't lie when they answered. And that sometimes happens. People are usually a little bit ashamed, for example, of voting for the extreme right. So if people have not yet made their mind, they're not really lying, but they're not going to declare in the sample that they're planning to vote for the extreme right unless they are really, really sure. And some of them, may think that it sounds bad, so they don't really want to admit it. And in that case, it's not that stats doesn't work. It's that people either change their mind or don't really say what they're going to vote. So very often the Survey Institute actually changed the results a little bit and increased the share of the extreme right compared to what the sample says.